Good morning and welcome to AM Joy. Yesterday was about as momentous a news day as we've had in this building, and we've had many. It started with the news that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General supervising the Robert Mueller investigation, is, quote, bracing to be fired by Donald Trump. There were the continued revelations from the blockbuster book by fired FBI Director James Comey, which drew attacks from Trump on Twitter and from the White House press secretary. After that came the reporting from ABC News and CNN that FBI agents seized recordings made by Donald Trump's longtime fixer, Michael Cohen, which included recordings between Cohen and the lawyer who represented two of the women who claimed to have had sexual relationships with Trump. We also learned that Cohen negotiated a $1.6 million settlement with a former model who said she had an affair with and got pregnant by Elliot Broidy, a major Trump backer and RNC deputy finance chair. Broidy stepped down from his RNC post Friday evening. Next came the bombshell revelation from McClatchy that Mueller has evidence confirming a crucial piece of the Christopher Steele dossier, that Michael Cohen did indeed travel to Prague in the summer of 2016, despite insisting to the media and to congressional investigators that he has never set foot in Prague. All of this happened before the president announced the bombing of targets in Syria.
The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States. We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents.
So quite a day yesterday, and we're going to get to all that other news shortly. But let's start with the Syrian attacks, which for many Americans raised real questions about the legal authority for the strikes, and also about whether even a part of the president's motivation was all that other news that just kept on coming yesterday. These are serious questions that we in the media have an obligation to ask, however uncomfortable, because they will be asked by our friends and our foes around the world. Join me now is Ayman Mohyeldin, MSNBC anchor Cal Perry, NBC News global editor Nayyera, former State Department senior advisor, and Malcolm Nance, MSNBC contributor and executive director of the Terror Asymmetrics Project. As I mangled everybody's titles, Cal, I'm going to come to you first. What was accomplished yesterday, according to military commanders?
Well, according to military commanders, it was, and according to the president, mission accomplished, which is not a great historical reference there, right? And I think he boxed himself in with the tweet he sent 3 days ago. On the one hand, if you strike targets that are going to change the course of the Syrian civil war, you're killing either Iranians or Russians. If you don't, and you do what happened last night, you're giving the Assad government a chance to say, we're still in charge, we were able to thwart the Americans, and you're giving the Russians the ability to say, see, our presence here is a good way of standing off the American government, the American military. Yeah, and Ayman, there was a sort of a disconnect between what the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, a.k.a. Mad Dog Mattis, wanted, and what John Bolton, the new national security advisor, who is extremely hawkish and very pro-war, wanted. So Mattis, according to Wall Street Journal, the military had scheduled potential windows for the strike, including one Thursday night. The U.S. and defense official said Mattis was able to cancel them out of concerns that anything other than a show strike risked broader escalation with the Russians in particular. Meanwhile, the same Wall Street Journal report says that Bolton favored a, quote, ruinous attack that would cripple some part of Assad's government and national infrastructure. According to a person familiar with his thinking, Bolton didn't want a reprise of the U.S.'s 2017 strike on Syria, which just hit an airfield that was easily repaired. Who seems to have gotten what they wanted, Bolton or Mattis?
It seems that Mattis, General Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, has won out in the short term, and there's a few ways to look at it. One, this was not a unilateral United States strike. There was the involvement of the French and the United Kingdom. I think that brings to the argument a sense of legitimacy, although there's a lot of questions as to whether or not the broader international community wanted to see this. We heard from some Arab allies that were not happy with this, and certainly key members of the UN Security Council, Russia and China, would not be happy with this. So there was the argument that the General Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, wanted to have a bit of a coalition to make this appear that this was not just the United States acting unilaterally in kind of any contravention of international law. That's one. Two, the scope of the strike is extremely limited. Very high on production, very high on the theatrics of what they went after, very little on the substance of it. And you get that sense really from watching Syrian state media. People on the streets today celebrating in defiance, the Syrian president walking into the office, his presidential palace with his suitcase in hand.
Yeah.
So the tone that is coming out of Iran, out of Russia, out of Syria this morning is that the strike yesterday was very limited in nature, very limited in scope, perhaps a deterrent to some capacity, but certainly not a destruction of Syria's chemical weapons capability. At the end of the day, it's not going to change the calculus of the Syria's president about how this war is being carried out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nayyera, of course, it is not as if Syria and its allies, Iran and Russia, didn't know it was coming. Donald Trump tweeted a warning a few days ago, a couple of days ago. Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming, nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal, all initial caps, who kills his people and enjoys it, exclamation point. In addition to that, there is reporting that there was actually a more formal sort of diplomatic warning. So if Russia knew it was coming, if Syria knew it was going to happen, if they were able to move whatever chemical weapons or whatever munitions they didn't want to be hit with bombs, then what is the efficacy of such an action?
Well, and that's the big question, is that who is Donald Trump really speaking to? In his speech last night, he made a very strong humanitarian argument, which is not something that he's ever cared about with foreign policy before, right? It's always America first, America alone. Last night, he talked about the atrocities against these children and the moral responsibility that countries have to stand up with what's right. You contrast that with just a week earlier when he was talking about how the United States is going to be pulling out all 2,000 of its troops that are there to fight ISIS because the war against ISIS is over. So we have an erratic president who is clearly trying to appeal to people who watch these photos of Syrian children being gassed, the general public that wants to know that America still has the power to do something. On the other hand, you have General Mattis, who has the sensibility to realize that this could potentially put the Middle East into further chaos and the United States right in the middle of it. And so he is trying to speak to the Iranians, the Russians, the Arab allies, the Western world, and thread that needle in a very delicate way. Unfortunately, that does not a strategy or a plan make. So we do not know what the long-term purpose is in Syria. So what does mission accomplished mean? Because clearly the Syrian war is ongoing. And just at the Pentagon press briefing this morning, we talked about how this was a very targeted and limited strike. It was not to topple the regime, yet Trump's reasoning was that it was supposed to end all atrocity. So this is the big question mark. What is the United States' goal in Syria, and what are we going to do to accomplish it?
And Malcolm, it would probably help if we had a Secretary of State who could do the talking rather than, when the guy called Mad Dog is the voice of reason, the defense secretary is having to be Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, apparently. The U.S. has 2,000 soldiers fighting ISIS in Syria. Russia has about 2,900 soldiers. There are bombers, fighter jets, and anti-missile defense systems courtesy of Russia. Iran also, of course, an ally of the Assad government. Is there a way to go in and strike Syria without, in such a way that you do not, because you certainly don't want to kill Russian troops, you certainly don't want to kill Iranian troops and widen the war? So then again, I ask, what's the point?
Well, it's a good question. Ayman made a great point. This was a very, very limited strike, and it shows the influence of General Mattis, who you could almost see that he's like he didn't really want to do it, so he had to hit something. He hit storage facilities. He hit research and scientific facilities, even though many of the equipment inside those facilities may have been destroyed. They can reconstitute this, and we're sure they have stocks in a clandestine location. This attack was much closer to the way Bill Clinton carried out an attack in the early 1980s in retaliation for the attempt by Saddam's intelligence to kill George Herbert Walker Bush in a bomb in Kuwait. We only hit their headquarters at night, and he was roundly criticized for killing no one.
Yeah.
If you're going to really do this type of attack, you're going to have to make it tough, and you're going to have to get the people who were in there. This was sanitary. We killed no one. We didn't even damage their air defenses.
Yeah, and I think you were referring to the 1998 bombing of what people sort of dismissively called an aspirin factory in the Sudan.
That's right.
And so, Cal, I wonder, and I think it is an uncomfortable conversation to have, because there was this atmospherics behind what we saw happen yesterday, in which there were a series of negative stories about the president. He is under tremendous pressure. His personal lawyer is in the crosshairs of the FBI, of a federal investigation. And so, to make that analogy with Bill Clinton, who was in the midst of the Monica Lewinsky scandal when he ordered that bombing of al-Qaeda, which, of course, al-Qaeda was deadly and then later perpetrated 9/11. So you could make an argument either way. But I wonder how the defense establishment deals with the fact that we are having that other conversation about something that they were, they had to do. The commander-in-chief told me.
Right. Look, the facts are this president is totally unhinged on Twitter, right? I mean, a 3-day heads up on a military action is giving them way too much time to move the equipment. He's under incredible political pressure here in the United States. Then take the facts on the ground in Syria. 500,000 people dead, 11 million people displaced, 6 million of them internally, 5 million of them externally. Are these deconfliction missiles? It's confusing, right? Nothing is going to change on the ground in Syria. And frankly, these 500,000 people who were killed were not killed by chemical weapons. They were killed by conventional weapons, and that's likely to continue.
Yeah, and Ayman, I cannot miss the fact that Donald Trump is also the president who slammed the door shut on Syrian refugees coming to this country. If you want to help the people who are victims of Bashar al-Assad's heinous government, you might want to let some of them into the country who are asking to come. Trump says no. This civil war has been stretching on and on and on since, the Arab Spring, when Bashar al-Assad made it very clear he ain't going. And he's clearly not going. He has the backing of Iran and Russia. If we're not going in there to actually do something to end that slaughter, making this point, I wonder in the region, and if we can just put up the little map of the region, that you have Syria sitting right there near Iraq, near Jordan, near some of our allies, some of the places what message does it send in the region to have just done this?
Well, I think you can kind of pick up on the Pentagon spokeswoman's statement saying our goal in Syria is to defeat ISIS. So if you are Turkey, if you are Jordan, if you are any of the countries, Saudi Arabia, close ally, who want to see the United States be more robust in trying to bring an end to the civil war, in possibly even go as far as pushing for regime change in that country, you would be very disappointed to know that this evening, or at least this morning, it's been a long night for me, that, that the president and the spokesperson for the Pentagon are saying that is not the objective. Our objective is to defeat ISIS, but we also just want to make sure that we're sending this message that the use of chemical weapons is a violation of international law. On one hand, and this is the point that you make that I think is absolutely right, there's so many contradictions coming out of this White House, not just on the issue of accepting Syrian refugees, but the hypocrisy of saying it's okay to die by conventional weapons by the hundreds of thousands, but if you die by chemical weapons, that suddenly becomes a threat to our national security. You saw the president in 2013 say President Obama needs to have authorization from Congress to carry out a strike. He went. President Trump did not go to Congress. I know, and President Trump did not even go to Congress to seek that authorization. He said President Obama's strike on Syria would be a disaster. Here he is now doing the same exact thing. And
there are plenty of tweets, Nayyera, of Donald Trump saying that it was a bad idea to go into Syria. He was very much against it. Just weeks ago, he wanted to pull completely out. There isn't a sort of message that makes sense. And by the way, if we're there fighting ISIS, so is Bashar al-Assad. So it's not like he and ISIS are on the same side. There are so many conflicting sides here. He's fighting an insurgency. He's also fighting with ISIS. I want you, since you worked in the State Department, to tell me, how do we communicate all of this, which seems so contradictory, without a Secretary of State?
We don't, and actually that's a big part of the problem, is that there is no diplomatic effort ongoing. Prior in the Obama administration, we had a diplomatic effort that was supposed to be going alongside the threat of military intervention, which is generally you have a tactical military strike and your diplomats come in after the pressure has been put on the enemy. Your diplomats come in to try to figure out and what's going to move forward. So if you're going to have a military strike, you have to think about what else other than Assad. If Assad goes, what is the purpose? The Obama administration effort, which included Russia, was to bring the opposition to the table, bring the regime to the table, and figure out what a post-Assad government could look like. Those negotiations are not happening right now because we have a president who thinks that negotiation alone is a sign of weakness. He is not using all the tools in the toolbox that we have for national security.
And to that point, really quickly, we don't have an ambassador in Egypt in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar. Three of the strongest American allies in the region, in addition to the fact that we do not have a State Department, a Secretary of State. So you don't even have the diplomatic foot soldiers who are waking up in capitals of Arab cities today and saying to those governments, here are the next steps. Here's what we need from you. Here's what we can offer you to get on board with this. There's a diplomatic vacuum, and you were asking what happens in terms of the message we're sending. We're not sending any messages.
Right. Well, I mean, but Malcolm, we have Jared. Jared's job was to solve all of the Middle East problems. He's besties with the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. He's, you know, pitching loan ideas to Qatar. Where is Jared?
Well, to be honest, who cares? Because he is not a player in this. What has happened here, and Ayman just made another really good point. Our diplomacy is a giant vacuum, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Many ambassadors have not been appointed. Virtually no undersecretaries are sitting in their positions. So that means General Mattis and the Defense Department are the de facto diplomats in this engagement. They are actually speaking and doing diplomacy with a hammer. And if that's the case, then we're going to be fighting these wars a very long time.
I'm going to have everybody hang on. Everybody's coming back. So I'm going to let everybody come back so we can go pay for all of this and take a commercial break. Coming up,